So in Mesopotamia, they have a specific myth, creation story, known as the Enuma Elish, which tells a tale basically of primeval powers. So that's what you will find in almost all creation stories worldwide. There's a fairly specific pattern. Of course, they do not all fall under this, but many of them do, especially in the ancient Near East and in Europe. So you have these primeval forces or primeval powers. In this case, in the ancient Babylonian, you have Apsu and Tiamat, which are freshwater and saltwater, respectively. And they're sort of commingled together. And eventually they decide to create the first generation of gods. So what you have at this point is going to be known as a theogony, or the birth or creation of the gods. So if we get some space here, you can see the process unfold. So primeval powers is what you start with. Next, you're going to have a theogony. So in the theogony, you're going to have the first round of gods. So the first major gods. And one of the main gods that you have in the Enuma Elish is going to be Ea, which is EA is how you would write it out. And they're making a lot of noise, the first generation of gods, and they're disturbing some of these primeval powers, these personified primeval powers. And eventually there's going to be a clash and a conflict. So there's always some battle between the primeval powers and then the first round of gods. You see the same thing in Hesiod's theogony, where he's describing the Titans and then the primeval powers that gave birth to the Titans. And then eventually there's going to be another round of battles between the Olympian gods versus the Titans. So there's this constant power struggle going on in most of these creation stories. And one god will come out on top normally. And so the Enuma Elish is actually telling a very specific story. It's arguing for the supremacy of Marduk, who is sort of the patron god of Babylon, and putting him up on a pedestal. Because what's going to happen eventually in this account is you're going to have the creation of the gods, and then you're going to get Marduk later on, and he is going to slay Tiamat, the saltwater, the personification of saltwater, chaos, basically. So Tiamat represents chaos. And that's what I really want all of you to understand. In almost every ancient myth, you're going to have, in the creation story, order, triumph over chaos. That's what it is. It's somehow there's an ordering principle or force being brought to an originally chaotic state. And that's what's really going on. And in this case, it's also going to be arguing for the supremacy of Babylon as well, which is, you get a lot too, arguing for the supremacy of one city or other. So, a theogony. Then next, you have a cosmogony, or a creation of the cosmos. So the stars, the planets, and if they already were in existence in some of the stories, then you'll have, once again, order or motion being brought to them, something to that effect. So after you have the cosmos and the planets all created, then you will frequently have at the end of a lot of these creation accounts an anthropogony, so the birth or creation of man. So that will normally be the last thing in these creation stories. But, like I said, it doesn't always follow this strict pattern of primeval powers, theogony, cosmogony, anthropogony, which I'll put up here. So, this is the general pattern that you will find, though, in myths. So, in Mesopotamia, another important early story, something that we learn from cracking cuneiform, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the earliest example of an epic poem that we have. And it's extremely important because it also tells us about the human condition. What were the main concerns of people back then, 4,000, 5,000 years ago? And not surprisingly, they have some of the same concerns that we have today. So it has to do with the human condition. Thus they are perennial or timeless concerns. In this case, death and immortality. So what does death mean? Can we survive death? Can we cheat death? And that's what Gilgamesh is going to basically attempt to try and cheat death. And it normally doesn't go well for a lot of the heroes. It doesn't pan out the way that they originally planned. Let's put it that way. So one other very important thing that you have in the Epic of Gilgamesh is you have an account of the flood. Now, these earliest Mesopotamian stories have been shown to have a major impact on biblical accounts. So, in the book of Genesis, where you have the creation story that most Jews, Christians, and even to a lesser extent, Muslims are going to draw on it, you have almost verbatim the same story of the flood as you would find in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The only real difference that I'm aware of are the amount of days that the flood lasts. So 40 days versus 4 or 5 days or something like that. But basically they're the exact same story, which shouldn't come as a major shock because cultural diffusion, they're in roughly the same area. So the ancient Hebrew people are going to be coming out of that region, out of part of the Fertile Crescent, so they would have been familiar with these stories. But the stories are always evolving. So if you look at the story in the Bible in Genesis 1, it's not going to be exactly the same. But there's plenty of parallels. So you have the waters mixed with the waters, and then the waters being separated from one another in the beginning of Genesis. So fresh and salt water being pulled apart, and a dome in the sky where the fresh water now resides over this dome. So you have to put this in more literal terms, actually. We might think and want to read all of this allegorically or metaphorically, which is useful. But the ancient people, they were trying to basically use an empirical method and explain the world around them. The problem is they didn't have modern science and they didn't have the technology and instruments to figure out what we know today. So when they're talking about there being a dome in the sky, we can understand that literally, that there was a firmament or bronze dome in the sky, and that there were stars in that dome or above the dome, and that there's water over it, fresh water, which makes sense because when it rains, there's fresh water. And salt water is on Earth, just like we have the oceans. And then beneath the Earth, if you go into caves or something like that, there seems to be this subterranean, mysterious realm. So what do we get out of all this? What's sort of the worldview or paradigm that you get? The metaphysics of it all from these early stories. And this is something that I absolutely want you all to take away from this. In both the Mesopotamian creation account and in the ancient Hebrew account and in so many others, you're going to have what's called the three-story universe. So I'll do my best to try and illustrate it up here. We need space. So, It's quite simple, really. There's three main levels. In the center, you have Earth. Represented as a flat disk. On the sides, you have these vast oceans. Makes perfect sense because that's how things look to them. Think about how large the Pacific Ocean is. You look up above, what do you see? Stars. What else do you see though when you look up? Well, sometimes it's raining. So it seems reasonable that there must be some sort of water or ocean up above and some dome holding up the sky that can hold up these stars and planets and everything else that are up there. But it also seems reasonable that there's something beneath us, since, like I said, there's caves within the earth and stuff like that. So we'll put UW for underworld. This is your basic model, 3-story universe that you have in almost every ancient society. So the heavens, the firmament up above, fresh water above it, the plane of the earth, which is viewed as a disk, flat disk normally, and then the underworld, which, very important here, the underworld is not hell. Hell is a concept that comes about much later. Although, interestingly enough, the more modern understandings of hell do come from the area of Mesopotamia, but it's much, much later with Zoroastrians that actually really influenced the Jewish, what will become the Jewish understanding of there being more of this radical bifurcation of heaven and hell, and influences Christianity, of course, more than anyone else. But at this point in time, for thousands of years, it's the underworld. That's all it is. We're pretty much clay pots with air in us. When we die, if there is anything at all that survives, it's a shade of our former existence. And it goes to the underworld. Achilles, he's in the underworld. Hades. Hades is not hell. It's just the underworld. Okay? Sheol. S-H-E-O-L. So in the Jewish understanding, same idea. It's a shadow realm. You're a shade of your former self. And if you're not actively being punished. Now, that said, it's still supposed to be quite boring, and you have people lamenting, like Achilles, that how much he would prefer to just be like a poor peasant or farmer alive rather than stuck down in Hades. But it's not a place of active punishment based upon your sins or your deeds. That comes about later. So, for today, that's it. But please make note of this model, because it is truthfully everywhere, and it's the first major cosmology, metaphysical paradigm that we have as human beings. And there are going to be some key changes as we move forward in time throughout this lecture series. And we'll see that it's normally science and technology that are frequently going to drive a shift in the philosophical and religious worldviews. But then again, the philosophical and religious worldviews are frequently influencing the scientific. So it's a constant interplay between these various forces.